"You are beneath me," he said. The words arrived without cruelty. That was the part Beatrice Ashworth had never quite managed to forgive. Not the contempt she might have argued against, not the cold theatre of a man performing his station, but the quiet, clinical certainty of someone stating a fact about weather or wool prices. Frederick Alcott, then the young heir to Dunmore Hall, had said it with the same measured patience he might have used to correct a household ledger. He had not even looked up from the papers on his desk. She was 17. She had just asked, with all the composure she could arrange in her plain dress and her borrowed pen, whether there might be any formal acknowledgement of the work she had done managing his father's correspondence for the past 11 months. He had not looked up, he had simply said it. And now she was 31 years old, standing on the gravel drive of Thornfield House, the estate that sat precisely 40 yards from the western wall of Dunmore Hall, watching the last of her furniture arrive by cart, and she found that the memory was useful to her in the way that a well-built bridge is useful. Not beautiful, perhaps, but load-bearing, and she had learned to be grateful for things that held. She had bought Thornfield House for £12,000 and a year of patient correspondence with 3 different solicitors. She had paid in full. Beatrice pressed one hand briefly against the stone gatepost, then picked up her inventory list from the top of the luggage stack and went inside. The house smelled of beeswax and old timber and something floral that the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Laura Hobbs, who had met her at the door with a key and no ceremony, which Beatrice had found immediately restoring, had placed in the front hall in a ceramic jug. The arrangement was not fashionable. It was generous, which Beatrice ranked considerably higher. "The East Wing rooms are prepared," Mrs. Hobbs said, falling into step beside her with the efficient quiet of someone who had managed a household before and did not require instruction to begin. "The library shelves need dusting. The kitchen range wants a new flue piece. I've written for the ironmonger. The back garden wall has a section of loose stone. I've marked it." She produced a small notebook. Beatrice looked at it. "You've been here 2 days," she said. "3, Mrs. Hobbs said. Beatrice took the notebook. She liked people who kept notebooks. She stood in the hall of her own house, purchased outright, deed registered in her name, Beatrice Elspeth Ashworth, formerly of no fixed consequence, and looked out through the east window toward the wall that separated Thornfield's grounds from Dunmore's parkland. She could not yet see the hall from here. She would be able to, she knew, from the upper study window. She had not bought this house for the view. She was very clear with herself about that. She had bought it because it was a sound property at a fair price, because the kitchen gardens were productive, because the solicitor had told her it was becoming available, and she had the capital, and the interest, and the legal standing. She had not bought it to be 40 yards from Frederick Alcott. She went upstairs to her study and looked out the window. Dunmore Hall stood in its parkland, like a ship that had been anchored too long, still impressive, still architecturally correct, but somehow settled in a way that suggested no one had been steering it with any particular conviction. The east facade showed 2 broken gutters. The kitchen garden wall, even at this distance, was clearly in need of repointing. The timber yard had a stack of lumber that had been sitting long enough to begin greening at the corners. Beatrice looked at it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she looked at her inventory list. Then she returned to work. She had been managing her own affairs for 14 years, ever since she had left Dunmore Hall on a grey October morning with 12 shillings, a letter of character from the elder Mr. Alcott that had been carefully worded to mean almost nothing, and a complete account in her own private ledger of every task she had performed, every creditor she had negotiated with, every supply contract she had renegotiated at favourable terms during the 11 months she had served as the estate's unofficial and entirely unpaid manager of correspondence and accounts. She had kept that ledger. She had known, even at 17, that records were the only argument that reliably held. From Dunmore, she had gone to the household of a retired solicitor in Derbyshire, named Mr. Patrick Carmichael, who had hired her within 4 minutes of reading her letter of application, not the letter of character from old Mr. Alcott, which he had set aside after one glance, but the 3-page summary of the Dunmore accounts reorganisation that she had attached without being asked. He had looked up from the pages with an expression she had come to recognise over the years as the specific face people made when they encountered something they had not expected to find where they were looking. "You did this at 17, he had said. "From 16 to 17, she had said. "I was not credited for it." He had looked at her for a long moment. "You will be credited here," he had said, and he had meant it, which she had verified within the first week by checking whether the household's quarterly accounts bore her name on the summary page. They did. She had stayed with Mr. Carmichael for 4 years and learned everything about estate law, creditor negotiation, and the formal language of property agreements that she had not already taught herself. When he retired to Bath at the age of 73, he had written her a letter of recommendation that was so precisely, so accurately flattering that she had read it twice before she believed he had intended it as written. He had also left her, in his will, the small matter of £400 in acknowledgement of services rendered, with a separate handwritten note that said only, "You were worth considerably more than I paid you." She had framed neither the letter nor the note. She had used the £400 as the first capital in a series of careful investments in wool trading and agricultural supply contracts that had, over the following decade, produced the £12,000 she had paid for Thornfield House. She had learned early that competence, reliably demonstrated and precisely documented, was the one currency that crossed the borders of class without requiring permission. The first time she had understood this was not at Dunmore, and not with Mr. Carmichael. It was earlier. She was perhaps 14, sitting with her father in his study while he reviewed the tenancy agreements for their small family property in Wiltshire. Her father had been a competent man in many respects, but an indifferent record-keeper, and the tenancy agreements had accumulated over the years into a state of productive confusion. Beatrice had spent a Sunday afternoon organising them. Her father had looked at the result, the agreements sorted by date, cross-referenced by tenant name, with a margin notation on each one indicating the renewal date and any outstanding disputes, and he had put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Bea, you see things." She had not known, at 14, what that meant precisely. She knew now. It meant that the structure underneath the surface of things, the agreement beneath the agreement, the actual flow of money beneath the reported flow, the real problem beneath the stated problem, was visible to her in a way that it was not always visible to others. It was not magic, it was attention, applied systematically and without the distraction of ego. Her father had died when she was 15, leaving behind moderate debts, and an uncle who had arrived with efficient sympathy and installed himself as the property's manager within a fortnight. The uncle was not malicious. He was simply the kind of man who did not wonder who had been doing what work, because the answer to that question would have created obligations he found inconvenient. Beatrice had managed the household accounts for him for a year before the property was sold, and she was packed off to Dunmore Hall as a companion and correspondence assistant to old Mr. Alcott, who had been her father's neighbour and who had offered the position as an act of genuine, if imprecisely specified charity. She had arrived at Dunmore at 16 with a clean dress, her father's annotated copy of Blackstone's commentaries, and the habit of making lists. She had left at 17 with 12 shillings, a ledger, and the words "You are beneath me" installed somewhere in her chest, like a stone that had been fitted too tightly to come loose easily. She had, over time, built around the stone. She was not going to remove it. She had decided, sometime in her early 20s, she remembered specifically that she was reviewing a wool merchant's contract for the 3rd time, and she found the clause that would have cost her trading partner £400 annually if he had signed it unmodified. She had decided that she was not going to become less than she was on account of something a young man had said, without looking up from his desk. She had modified the contract clause, recovered the £400 and gone on. She was good at going on. It was Mrs. Hobbs who first mentioned the Duke of Dunmore by name, on Beatrice's third morning at Thornfield House. She said it in the same practical register she used to discuss the flue piece and the loose garden wall, which Beatrice found she appreciated. His Grace took the hall back 4 years ago, Mrs. Hobbs said, pouring tea at the morning room table. After his father died, the old Duke had let things run down considerably. The new Duke, Frederick Alcott, came back from wherever he'd been and started in on repairs. He's got a proper land agent now, at least, which the old man never had. Stubborn business, getting Dunmore back into order. But he's made progress. Has he? Beatrice said. He has, Mrs. Hobbs said, with the particular precision of someone who has answered a question and not a subtext. He tends to do things himself, from what the village says, out in the yard before the tenants are up, doesn't keep much company. Lost his mother young, the old Duchess died when he was 12, and the old Duke was not what you'd call a warming presence. His Grace lives up there like a man who's decided that what he does is more important than who sees him doing it. Beatrice looked at her tea. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like information. Thank you, Mrs. Hobbs, she said. There's also the matter of Lady Sefton, Mrs. Hobbs continued, with the equanimity of someone completing an inventory. She's the daughter of the Earl of Barton. She's been pointed at Dunmore for 2 years or so. Very credentialed, very present. Her father and the old Duke had an understanding, though nothing was ever formalised. She visits about once a month and stays for a week at the Barton property in the village. The village has an opinion about it. The village generally does, Beatrice said. Mrs. Hobbs looked at her with the mild, level expression that Beatrice had already begun to think of as her most accurate one. I thought you'd want the full picture, she said. I do, Beatrice said. Thank you. She finished her tea, picked up her morning list, and went to review the kitchen accounts. She had been at Thornfield for 2 weeks when she first saw Frederick Alcott in person. She was walking the west perimeter of her property. She walked it each morning, which was both exercise and professional intelligence gathering, since the state of the boundary told her things about drainage and soil and the general upkeep of neighbouring land, when she heard him before she saw him, not his voice, the sound of a hammer against stone, steady and deliberate, coming from the other side of the wall. She stopped. She looked at the wall. The section of loose stone that Mrs. Hobbs had marked was 4 feet to her left. She moved to the gap. There was not quite a gap, but the stones were loose enough that standing close to it admitted sound more clearly, and she stood there for a moment. The hammering was his. She knew it by the rhythm, which was not a workman's rhythm, but something more considered, as though the person holding the hammer was also thinking. She did not call out. She returned to her morning walk and completed her perimeter inspection in the usual order. He appeared at her front door at 11 o'clock. She heard the knock from the study, where she was reviewing a wool trading contract that a former business associate had sent for her opinion. She waited. Mrs. Hobbs opened the door. There was a low exchange of words. Then Mrs. Hobbs appeared in the study doorway with the particular expression of someone who has already decided that the appropriate response is neutrality. The Duke of Dunmore, ma'am. He says he is calling to welcome you to the neighbourhood. Beatrice looked at the contract page she had been reviewing. There was a clause on it that needed correction. She finished making the notation in the margin. Then she set down her pen, straightened her spine and stood. Show him to the morning room, she said. I'll be 2 minutes. She was 1 minute and 40 seconds. She knew this because she counted, not from any dramatic impulse, but because she was a person who measured things, and the measurement was interesting. Frederick Alcott was standing at the morning room window when she entered, looking out at the garden with the same quiet attention she had noticed, years ago, was his default. He was taller than she remembered, Or perhaps she remembered him as shorter because she had been younger and he had been seated. He was dressed plainly, dark coat, no ornamentation. The cravat, she noticed immediately, was slightly off-center to the left. He turned when he heard her enter. He looked at her. He was very still. Beatrice had rehearsed nothing. She had specifically decided, at some point during the past 14 years, that she would not rehearse anything for this moment. She had been correct. Her performance, if it could be called that, was simply herself. "Your Grace," she said, "how do you do?" He was quiet for a moment, not a long moment, but a considered one, as though he was processing something he had not fully anticipated. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was the same, lower perhaps than she remembered, more settled. "I heard you had taken Thornfield." "I have," she said. "Purchased it outright, 4 weeks ago. Please sit down." He sat. She sat across from him. Mrs. Hobbs appeared with tea, set it down with the minimum of ceremony that was her professional signature, and withdrew. There was a pause. It was not uncomfortable. Beatrice let it stand. "You have done well," he said. It was not a compliment in the usual register. It was an observation, the same tone he had used 14 years ago, but applied to a different conclusion. He was looking at her with the measuring attention she remembered, but it was different now too. Then, it had been the attention of someone dismissing. Now it was the attention of someone who was not quite sure what he was looking at. "Yes," she said simply. He looked at his tea. "I owe you an apology," he said. She had not expected that. She arranged her face to show that she had not, because she was not going to pretend otherwise. "I see," she said. "What I said to you. I was 22 years old, and I had said something that I believed was a fact about the way the world was arranged. I have spent some years since then reconsidering whether the arrangement was correct." He paused. "I do not say this to unwrite what was said. I say it because I prefer to account for what I have done." Beatrice looked at him. He had grey in his hair at the temples. He looked like someone who had spent 4 years repairing something large by himself. He looked, she thought, like a man who had replaced his father's confidence with something quieter and better constructed, but had not yet been sure it was load-bearing. "Thank you," she said. She meant it precisely as much as she said it, which was not nothing, but was not forgiveness either. It was acknowledgement. It was the thing she would have offered anyone who said what he had said, with the seriousness with which he said it. He nodded once. He picked up his tea. "Your gutters need attention," she said. "The east facade, 2 of them, I noticed from the upper study window." He looked at her with the particular stillness of a person encountering something they do not know how to categorize. "You noticed from your upper window," he said. "I notice things," she said. "It is a habit. I do not mean it as a criticism. I mean it as information, in case it had not been reported to you." "It had," he said. "I am attending to it." There was another pause, easier this time, like a stone settled into its correct position. "I remember your accounts work," he said. "The Dunmore correspondence ledger. My father showed it to me years later, when I came back and found it in the estate records room. I recognized your handwriting." Beatrice set down her cup. She kept her face arranged. There was something moving in her chest that she identified as old and familiar, and not appropriate to display in a morning room, and she chose not to display it. "I kept a copy," she said. "I know," he said. "I found a note at the back of the ledger that said as much." She had written that note at 17, on her last morning at Dunmore, in the precise, clear hand she had cultivated for professional documents. A copy of these accounts has been retained by B.E. Ashworth for her own records. She had wanted someone to know that the work had not simply dissolved into the walls of the house when she walked out. "I thought it might be relevant someday," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. It was not the measuring attention of their first meeting in this room, nor the measuring attention of 14 years ago. It was something else, quieter, more deliberate, like a man who has made a decision and is still holding it, not yet ready to speak it aloud. "I am sure you are right," he said. He finished his tea. He stood, the way a man stands, when he knows how to end a scene, without making it theatrical. He bowed, correctly and without excess. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Miss Ashworth." "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. She walked him to the door herself. She watched him cross the gravel drive and go out through the gate toward Dunmore's parkland. The morning was clear and cold. The loose stones in the perimeter wall were still loose. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not thinking about him particularly, simply recording the morning as it had been, which was her habit with mornings that contained new information. Then she went back to the wool trading contract and corrected the clause. It was Mr. Thomas Whitmore who first told Beatrice that matters at Dunmore were more complicated than a list of deferred repairs. Whitmore was the retired land agent she had known through the wool trading network, a small, precise man of 68 who had spent 30 years managing agricultural estates in the north and had spent his retirement offering informed opinions to anyone who asked, and a few who had not. He had appeared at Thornfield 3 weeks after Beatrice's arrival, on the grounds that he was visiting the neighborhood, and had heard she had settled here, which Beatrice suspected was approximately half true. "The Dunmore entailment is the problem," he said, seated in her library, with a glass of Madeira and the expression of someone who enjoys transmitting useful intelligence. The old Duke's debts were large, and more to the point, the instruments of debt are held by a consortium of 4 investors, the principal one being a man named Gerald Harlow, who is not a pleasant person and who has been pushing for a repayment schedule that the estate cannot currently meet. His Grace has been rebuilding the estate's productivity for 4 years, but the consortium's terms allow them to call the debt in 18 months, and if they call it, Dunmore is not in a position to pay it. Beatrice looked at him. "What are the debt instruments? Notes? Mortgage agreements? Mortgage instruments against the Eastern Parkland and the home farm acreage. 6 of them. Harlow holds 4, the other 2 investors hold 1 each. And the terms? 12% interest annually, compounding. The initial principal was £22,000. Beatrice did her arithmetic. 14 years of compound interest, at 12%, against £22,000. She did not do it in her head. She took her notebook from the table and did it precisely. The result was not good. She wrote the figure down and looked at it. "He knows this," she said. "He knows the outline," Whitmore said. "He knows the debt exists and that it is large. I am not confident he knows the specific compound figure, because his land agent, who is a capable enough man, is not a mathematical specialist, and the instruments are written in the kind of language that obscures the mechanism if you don't know where to look." Beatrice looked at her calculation. She thought about the east facade gutters, reported to him but not yet repaired. She thought about the greening lumber in the timber yard. She thought about the way he had looked when he said, "I am attending to it." Not a man who was complacent, but a man who was attending to the wrong list. "Does he know you're telling me this?" she asked. "He does not know I'm here," Whitmore said, "though I suspect it will surprise neither of us, particularly when he finds out." He looked at her over his Madeira glass. "You have the sharpest eye for a debt instrument of anyone I've worked with, Beatrice. If you wanted to look at those 6 mortgage papers, I could arrange for you to see them." She looked at her calculation again. "Yes," she said. She would say, later, that she had no particular investment in the outcome of Dunmore Hall's debt situation. She would say it to Mrs. Hobbs, who would receive the statement with the same mild accuracy she brought to all statements, and she would be, at best, partially right. She did not need Frederick Alcott to be solvent. She did not need Dunmore Hall to survive. She had her own house, her own capital, her own ledger. But she had spent 14 years thinking about a stone dropped into still water, and she understood compound effects. She reviewed the 6 mortgage instruments over 3 days, in Whitmore's company, at the table in her study. On the 3rd day, she found a clause. It was in the 4th instrument, Harlow's primary holding, buried in the third subsection of the repayment terms, written in the contracted language of a solicitor who had been either very lazy or very clever. The clause stated that in the event that a third party demonstrated a documented improvement in estate productivity of 15% or greater within any rolling 18-month period, the interest rate applicable to the outstanding principal would be reduced to 8% for the subsequent term, provided the improvement was verified by an independent assessor and submitted in writing to the consortium. Beatrice read the clause 4 times. She was quite still while she did it. Then she read the estate productivity records that Whitmore had also obtained, the figures for the past 3 years of Dunmore's operations, which showed a 14.6% improvement in output from the home farm and tenant rents combined. 14.6%, against a 15% threshold. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table. She said, "Get me the full accounts from the timber yard." Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "The timber?" "The lumber stack, the one by the east timber yard. If it has been sitting long enough to green, it was cut during the preceding accounting period, but has not been sold or entered into the productivity records. Unsold inventory that was produced counts toward output." Whitmore looked at her for a moment, with the particular expression she recognized from Mr. Carmichael, from her father, from a handful of people over the years. He went for the timber records. The timber inventory, added to the recorded output figures, brought the productivity improvement to 16.3%, 3 weeks inside the rolling period, clearly documentable, clearly verifiable. The difference between 8% interest and 12% interest on the outstanding principal, compounded over the remaining term, was £11,400. Beatrice wrote the summary. It took her 1 afternoon. She made 2 copies, as was her habit. The question of what to do with it was not simple. She was not Dunmore's agent. She had no formal standing in the estate's affairs. She had purchased a house 40 yards away and reviewed a set of debt instruments out of what she preferred to describe as professional interest. She could send the summary to Whitmore and let him forward it through proper channels. She could send it directly to the Duke of Dunmore's solicitor. She could leave it entirely alone, which was also a choice, and one that the weight of evidence suggested would result, in approximately 18 months, in Harlow's consortium forcing the sale of the eastern parkland, which would in turn undermine the home farm's drainage, which would in turn reduce the estate's agricultural output, which would be followed by the home farm acreage, which would be followed eventually by Dunmore Hall itself. She did not want Dunmore Hall to fall. She had examined this feeling carefully and found it was true regardless of its origins, which were mixed and not entirely comfortable to look at directly. She sent a note to the Duke of Dunmore's front door in her own hand. It said, "I have found something in the estate mortgage instruments that requires your attention. If you are willing to call at Thornfield House this week, I can show it to you. B.E. Ashworth." He came the next morning. He arrived at 9 o'clock, which was early for a social call and not early for a professional one. Beatrice had the papers laid out on the study table in the order she intended to present them. She had also made tea, which Mrs. Hobbs brought without being asked, because Mrs. Hobbs was the kind of housekeeper who understood the relationship between difficult meetings and the presence of tea. Frederick sat across the table from her and read. He read carefully and without speaking, which she appreciated. He went through the mortgage instruments in the order she had arranged them, made 1 or 2 notations in his own notebook, and came to the summary page last. He was very still for a moment. "I did not know about this clause," he said. "I thought you might not," she said. "It is written to obscure itself. It is the kind of language that repels reading. My solicitor reviewed these instruments." "Your solicitor is a property lawyer," she said. "The mechanism in this clause is financial mathematics, dressed in legal clothing. The 2 disciplines do not always speak to each other." He looked at the summary figure, £11,400. He looked at it the way a person looks at something that changes a calculation they have been running for 4 years. You would need to present this before the consortium within 40 days, she said. The rolling period closes after that. The timber inventory is the element that crosses the threshold, and it was produced within the qualifying window, but not by much. How did you know about the timber inventory? He said. I noticed the lumber stack from the western perimeter of my property, she said. It had been cut, but not sold. Unsold productive inventory is still productive output. It simply needed to be entered correctly. He looked at her. There was something in his face she had not seen in their morning room conversation, or at any point in the 14 years she had known of him, without being in the same room with him. It was the specific expression of a man who has been managing something enormous alone for a long time, and has just been shown that there is another person in the room who can see the same structure he has been seeing. It was not relief exactly. It was something older and quieter than relief. The consortium meeting, he said. Harlow chairs it. He will not yield this clause without a fight. He does not have to yield it, she said. The clause is in the instrument. If the evidence of productivity is correctly documented and submitted within the window, the clause activates by the terms of his own agreement. He has no legal basis to refuse it. He will invent one. He may try, she said, which is why the documentation needs to be precise and complete, and submitted through a formal assessor, not through his own representatives. She paused. I can prepare the documentation. He looked at her. You do not have any formal standing in Dunmore's affairs. No, she said, but I am very good at this kind of work, and I would be doing it as your retained advisor, which would give me standing. You would need to engage me formally. I would require a contract. She watched him absorb the shape of what she was saying. He was not a slow thinker. He was a careful one, which was different. You are proposing to help me, he said. I am proposing to be employed by you, she said. Those are related, but not identical. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile exactly. It was the precursor to one, the architecture of it, without the performance. I see, he said. What would be your terms? She had written them the previous evening, which she had thought was perhaps premature, but had done anyway, because preparation was not presumption. She slid a single page across the table. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. This is a fair rate, he said, in a tone that suggested he had expected something less. I am not trying to profit from your difficulties, she said. I am proposing a professional engagement at the market rate for the work. He looked at her, a long, considering look, the kind that she had learned was his version of an expression, because his face did not move much, but his attention moved considerably. I know, he said. That is what I mean. It is fair because you are fair. You could have asked for considerably more. I could have, she said. I did not. He signed the contract page. She countersigned it. She made a copy, as was her habit. Your cravat, she said, as he was gathering his papers. It has been off-center for the entire meeting, to the left. He looked at her. He reached up and adjusted it without visible self-consciousness. How long? Since you arrived, she said. 40 minutes. You waited 40 minutes to mention it, he said. I was occupied, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood, and he bowed, and she thought, she did not perform this thought, she simply had it, that he was the most contained person she had ever been in the same room with, and that containment, in her considerable experience of people, was either the sign of someone who had nothing inside, or the sign of someone who had made a decision about what he was, and was holding it. She was beginning to form a view on which it was. The consortium meeting was set for the last Thursday of the month, to be held at the offices of Harlow's solicitors in the county town, with all 4 investors present and 2 independent assessors appointed by the Lord Lieutenant's office, because Beatrice had advised that independent assessors were non-negotiable, and Frederick had agreed and arranged it. In the intervening 3 weeks, Beatrice worked. She prepared the productivity documentation with the precision she had been applying to financial arguments since she was 22 years old. She organized the home farm figures, the tenant rent records, the wool output summaries, and the timber inventory into a single bound report, 41 pages, with a covering summary that was 2 pages and stated the essential calculation in plain language that could not be obfuscated by Harlow or anyone in his employ. She cross-referenced every figure against its source document. She annotated each of the 6 mortgage instruments with tab markers at every relevant clause. She prepared a separate schedule showing the exact date and method by which the timber inventory qualified within the rolling productivity period. She also had 3 conversations with Frederick that were not about the documentation. The first was in her library, when he came to review the draft report, and stayed long enough that Mrs. Hobbs brought a second tea without being asked. They were discussing the structure of the covering summary when he said, without preamble, "My mother played the pianoforte. She played a particular piece, a set of variations on a Scottish air. I cannot recall the name of it. I have not been able to recall it for 20 years, and I have not heard it played by anyone." Beatrice looked at him. She did not know where this had come from, but she recognized the register. A man putting down something he had been carrying, briefly, because the room felt safe enough to set it on the table for a moment. "Can you hum it?" she said. He looked briefly as though no one had ever asked him that. Then he hummed, 4 bars, quietly, a Scottish air she recognized, because she had been playing seriously since she was 14, and she had a good memory for music. "That is a set of variations attributed to Nathaniel Gow," she said, "published in 1797. It is the second set of variations, rather than the first, that most people recall." She paused. "I play it." He was very still. "I know," he said. "I heard you. 2 weeks ago, in the evenings." She thought about her practice habit. She played in the evenings, in the Thornfield music room, with the windows open, because the room grew warm with the fire. She had not thought about the proximity of the houses in relation to the open windows. "I did not realize I could be heard at Dunmore," she said. "You cannot," he said. "Not from the house. I was walking the perimeter of the western parkland." A pause. 3 evenings. She looked at him steadily. He had walked the perimeter of his own estate for 3 evenings to hear her play his mother's composition through a window she had not thought to close. He did not say this as a confession or a declaration. He said it as a fact he was reporting, because he was a person who preferred to account for what he had done. She understood this about him. She found she had understood it for some time. "I will play it again," she said, "whenever you wish to hear it." He nodded once. They returned to the covering summary. The second conversation was in his garden. He had asked her to walk the home farm's western boundary to confirm a drainage figure, and they had walked it in the early evening, with the light going amber and the field grass loud with insects. She had the surveyor's notes. He had the long memory of someone who had known this land since childhood and had come back to it with the specific grief of returning to something that had been neglected in your absence. He said, at the field's edge, "I was not a good young man." She did not fill the space he had left. She let it stand. "Not cruel," he said. "I do not think I was cruel, but I was certain about things I had not earned the right to be certain about. It is a particular quality of men of my position, I believe, and I had it in full." "Yes," she said. "I have been trying, for some years, to be a more careful thinker." She looked at the field. A crow moved along the fence line. The evening was warm, and the grass held the day's heat. She thought about 17 years old and 12 shillings and a ledger, and she thought about 31 years old and a contract signed on a study table with a copy made for both parties, and she thought that the distance between those 2 moments was the most interesting distance she had ever measured. "You said I was beneath you," she said. She said it without anger, the way she said things that were simply true. "You were wrong, but I think you know that." "I do know it," he said. I knew it the moment I read your ledger, 12 years after the fact. The evidence was very clear. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was its near neighbor. I thought it might be, eventually, she said. He looked at her. The evening light was doing something to the way his face was arranged, softening the containment, or perhaps revealing what was underneath it, which was not softness exactly, but something steadier. He was watching her, the way she had begun to understand he watched things that mattered to him, very still, very present, with the full weight of his attention. She picked up the surveyor's notes and wrote the drainage figure in the margin. The field will need a new catch drain along the north run, she said. There is subsidence in the third quadrant. I would estimate the work at £60 and 4 days of labour. I will arrange it, he said. The third conversation was late in the evening, before the consortium meeting, when he sent a note asking if she would come to Dunmore to review the final documentation before it was bound for submission. She went. She had been inside Dunmore Hall twice as a professional visitor in the preceding weeks, and each time the house had struck her differently, not as the place she had left at 17, because she had left that place and its attendant meanings behind with some deliberation, but as a house that was slowly remembering how to be inhabited. The library shelves were dusted, the east facade gutters had been repaired, the wall of the front passage had been repapered in a clean, unfashionable cream that suggested the Duke had chosen it himself and cared more about clean than fashionable. He was in the study with the documentation when she arrived. She reviewed it, found 2 minor errors in the tab markers for instruments 3 and 5, corrected them, and initialed the correction in the margin. He watched her work. She was aware of being watched, in the particular way she was always aware of him. Not an uncomfortable awareness, but a specific one, like a sound played at a consistent frequency that you stop consciously hearing, but that continues to organize the room. When she had finished, he said, I am glad you came back. She was very still for a moment. I did not come back to Dunmore, she said. I came to Thornfield. Yes, he said. I know. I am still glad. She looked at him. He was not performing this. He never performed anything, which was one of the most unusual things about him, and one of the things she had come, over the preceding weeks, to find the most. She searched for the word and found it. Restoring. So am I, she said, which was also simply true. She returned to Thornfield with the copy of the documentation under her arm, and Mrs. Hobbs's light still on in the kitchen, and she stood in the hall of her own house for a moment longer than she usually stood anywhere. Then she went to bed, because the consortium meeting was tomorrow, and she had not yet decided what to wear to the office of a hostile creditor, which was a practical question and deserved a practical answer. The offices of Harlow and Associates were in a building that had been designed to suggest solidity and ended up suggesting weight. Heavy oak paneling, heavy curtains, a meeting table large enough to lose 3 men and their ambitions, which was presumably the point. The 4 investors were arranged along one side, Harlow himself at the centre, a broad-shouldered man of 55, whose primary professional technique was the application of volume. The 2 minor investors, both of whom were visibly uncertain about their role in the proceedings, and a 4th man, Lord Ashby, who had told Beatrice through Whitmore that he had invested in the consortium as a favour to Harlow and had been regretting it for 6 months. The 2 independent assessors were seated at a smaller table to the left. Frederick sat across from Harlow with his solicitor. Beatrice sat beside Frederick, as his retained adviser, with the documentation bound in front of her. Lady Sefton was not present, which was not relevant, but was a fact Beatrice had noted. Harlow opened the meeting by saying that he did not understand why a stranger to the proceedings was seated at the table, at which point Frederick said, in the level voice he used for everything, Miss Ashworth is my retained financial advisor. She has prepared the documentation for today's submission. She is here in a professional capacity. Harlow looked at Beatrice with the expression of a man who has encountered something he considers a category error. A woman, he said, in a tone that completed the thought without requiring further words. Beatrice opened the documentation to the covering summary. The clause in question, she said, is in the fourth mortgage instrument, subsection 3 of the repayment terms. I have tabbed the relevant page. She set the bound document in front of the independent assessors. The productivity improvement figure is 16.3% against the clause's threshold of 15%. The supporting calculations appear on pages 6 through 17. The timber inventory that carries the improvement past the threshold was produced within the qualifying rolling period, as documented on pages 18 through 22. I would ask the assessors to verify the figures before we discuss Harlow's consortium's obligations under the clause. There was a suspended moment. The assessors looked at the documentation. They were thorough men. She had established this through inquiry before the meeting, and they spent 14 minutes reviewing the relevant pages in silence. Harlow spent those 14 minutes attempting several lines of objection, including that the timber inventory was unverified, that the rolling period calculation was incorrect, and that the clause itself required consortium consent to activate, none of which were supported by the instrument language, which Beatrice had annotated precisely for this purpose, and which she cited by page and line on each occasion, without raising her voice or altering her expression. She had managed creditor negotiations before breakfast for 14 years. She could manage this. The lead assessor looked up at the end of the 14 minutes. The documentation is in order, he said. The productivity threshold has been met within the qualifying period. The clause activates under the terms of the instrument as written. The applicable interest rate for the subsequent term is 8%. Harlow's face did something complex. It went through several arrangements before settling on the particular stillness of a man who has understood that the situation has moved past the point where volume is useful. This is irregular, he said. It is in the instrument, the assessor said, with the mild firmness of someone who has reviewed the clause 4 times and has no further use for the adjective irregular. The terms are clear. The woman prepared the documentation, Harlow said. There is no precedent for. The documentation is accurate, the assessor said. Its author is not material to its accuracy. The room was very quiet for a moment. Frederick stood. He did not look at Harlow. He looked at Beatrice. Then he did something that she did not expect. He took the bound documentation from the table, the 41-page report, the annotated instruments, the productivity schedule, the covering summary, and he held it for a moment, and then he set it back down in front of her. Miss Ashworth prepared this, he said to the room. I want it in the record that this analysis and the recovery of £11,400 in interest obligations was her work. Her name on the report is not a formality. The room had the particular stillness of a space in which something has shifted that cannot be unshifted. Lord Ashby, the fourth investor, cleared his throat. He was an older man, 70 perhaps, and he had been watching the proceedings with the expression of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to stop regretting his decision. Well, he said, to no one in particular, it appears she's rather good at this sort of thing. Harlow said nothing. He gathered his papers. His face was the face of a man who would find other methods of expressing his displeasure, but who understood, in this moment, that the numbers had been correct, and the clause had activated, and there was nothing in the room to argue with that would not make him look worse than he already did. The meeting concluded. The reduction was recorded. The interest rate for the subsequent term was confirmed in writing, initialed by both assessors. Beatrice closed her copy of the documentation. She did it without ceremony. Outside the window, the county town continued its ordinary business, which it had been conducting without reference to this meeting, and would continue without reference to its outcome. The world had not erupted. There had been a suspended moment, and then the truth had been undeniable, and now there was paperwork. Frederick was beside her. He said, quietly, so that only she could hear, "Thank you." She looked at him. The assessors were packing their documents. Harlow's party was leaving. Whitmore, who had appeared in the room at some point during the proceedings and positioned himself near the door, with the expression of a man who is trying very hard to look as though he arrived there by accident, caught her eye and nodded once with imperfectly concealed satisfaction. £11,400, she said to Frederick. Recovered. Yes, he said. The estate will need a more robust accounting system to prevent this kind of accumulated error in future, she said. I can propose a structure, if you wish. He was looking at her with the expression she had now identified, the one that was not quite a smile, but was the architecture of one. You are proposing more work, he said. I am proposing continued employment, she said, formally contracted, at the agreed market rate. He was quiet for a moment. The room had mostly emptied. Lord Ashby was pulling on his gloves near the door and pausing, in the way of an older man who has decided he has one more thing to contribute. She's right about the accounting structure, Lord Ashby said, not looking at either of them directly. Get it in order while you have the chance. He glanced at Beatrice briefly, with the specific expression of someone who has underestimated something and is acknowledging it in the only way available to him without explicitly saying so. Good documentation, he said. Very thorough. He put on his hat and left. Beatrice picked up her copy of the documentation. She put on her coat, which she had placed on the chair back with the particular care of someone who takes care of her things because they are her things and they matter. Frederick was standing very close. Not inappropriately close. He was never imprecise about physical proximity, but close enough that she was aware of it, in the specific way she had been aware of his presence since the first morning in the morning room, like a note played at a consistent frequency. He reached out and took the copy of the documentation from her hands. She let him take it. He looked at it for a moment. 41 pages of her work, the annotations in her hand, the tab markers initialed BEA, and then he set it gently back in her hands. It was the simplest possible gesture, and she felt it in her chest in a way that was not simple at all. Come back with me, he said, to Dunmore. I want to show you something. The estate accounts, she said. Yes, he said, and something else. They drove back in his carriage, which was quiet and correctly maintained and contained nothing unnecessary, because that was the kind of person he was. The county town disappeared behind them, and the countryside opened up, autumn and wide, and the colour of old maps. She looked out the window. I have been intending to say something to you, he said, for approximately 3 weeks. I have been waiting until the consortium matter was resolved, because I did not want you to think the two were connected. She turned from the window. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention. They are not connected, he said. What I want to say to you has nothing to do with your professional competence, though your professional competence is extraordinary, and I find it the most. He stopped. This was the first time she had seen him stop for a word. It was interesting. I find it the most remarkable quality I have encountered in another person, he said. But that is not what I want to say. She was very still. I want to ask you if you would consider a formal courtship, he said. Not because it would be convenient or appropriate, or because Dunmore requires. I am not asking because the estate requires anything, or because my solicitor has suggested it, or because Lady Sefton has been pointed at me for 2 years, and I find her unsuitable. I am asking because you have been the most. He paused again, differently this time, less for the word and more for the weight of it. Because you are the only person I have been in a room with in 20 years, who I did not want to leave when the time came to leave. The carriage moved through the autumn afternoon. Outside, the parkland wall of Dunmore appeared, and then Thornfield's gate appeared beside it, the two properties separated by 40 yards of gravel and 400 years of class machinery. Beatrice looked at him. She thought about it completely before she answered, which took some time, though the answer was not in doubt. She was thinking about the shape of it, what it would mean, and what it would cost, and what it would build, and whether she was willing. She was thinking about it the way she thought about everything, which was systematically, and without the distraction of hope or fear. "Yes," she said. "I would consider it." He looked at her. "That is not a yes," he said. "It is a considered yes," she said. "I am not going to give you an unexamined one." "Fair," he said, and the word carried everything he meant by it. They were married in the Dunmore Parish Church 7 months later, on a Thursday morning in April, in a ceremony attended by approximately 60 people, of whom perhaps half would have predicted the match a year earlier, and the other half would not have. Mr. Whitmore was there. Mrs. Hobbs was there, in a good dark dress, standing beside the Dunmore housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, who had welcomed Beatrice to the hall on her second professional visit, with a cup of tea and the information that the morning room fire had been lit, which was the kind of welcome that Beatrice had not forgotten. A young woman named Clara Stanhope, who had become Beatrice's particular friend during the months of the courtship, direct and unguarded in the manner of someone who had decided that Beatrice was worth her directness, sat in the second pew and cried openly, which she had told Beatrice she intended to do, and which she accomplished with complete composure in every other respect. Lord Ashby attended. He had said nothing particular to Beatrice in the preceding months, but he had revised his investment portfolio with the assistance of a financial advisor whose name appeared in his revised accounts as B.E. Ashworth, at the market rate for the work. Lady Sefton did not attend. She had, in the month since the consortium meeting, redirected her attention to a baronet in the next county, which the village had discussed with considerable industry, and which Beatrice had received as information without opinion. The elder Mr. Alcott's memory was present in the structure of the day, in the way that absences are always present at weddings. Frederick's father had died 4 years before the day, and had never seen the estate return to order, and had not, as far as anyone knew, revised his original view of what was structurally appropriate. But he was not there to hold the room in the direction of his certainties, and the room went in a different direction without him. After the ceremony, Frederick kissed her hand in the porch of the church, in front of the assembled 60 people, and then he looked at her with the full weight of everything he had never performed and said, "I am glad you came back." "I came to Thornfield," she said, as she had said before. "Yes," he said, "I know." He had not knelt in the church, she had not required it of him, and he had not offered it, but when they returned to Dunmore that evening, he went down on one knee in the entrance hall, without warning and without audience, except Mrs. Graves, who was passing through with a lamp, and who saw it, and who told Mrs. Hobbs about it the next morning in the kitchen over tea. "He did it like it was just the thing," Mrs. Graves said, "like there was nothing else to do," and Mrs. Hobbs said, "Yes, that sounds right." He said, on one knee in the entrance hall, "Not because it is expedient or required, or because the position demands a particular arrangement, but because you are the most capable and the most precisely honest person I have ever known, and because I have been in dozens of rooms in my life, and the only ones I can recall clearly are the ones you were in." She looked down at him for a moment. She thought about 17 years old and 12 shillings, and a stone dropped into still water, and she thought about the compound effect of 14 years, and she thought that the distance between the stone dropping and the ripple reaching the shore was exactly what she had always suspected it would be, worth it. "Get up," she said, not unkindly. "We have work to do." He stood. He smiled, which was rare and therefore completely legible. She reached up and straightened his cravat, which was again off-centre, and had been, she noted, for approximately 20 minutes. "You let it go that long," he said. "I was distracted," she said. "You were saying something important. Their son was born in the 2nd year of their marriage. They named him James Edward Alcott, Edward for Mr. Carmichael, who had sent a letter from Bath that contained 2 pages of carefully stated joy and 1 sentence of vindication. James had his father's stillness and his mother's eyes and a habit, from the time he could manage a pencil, of making lists. He was a cheerful and determined child, and he climbed out of his crib at 14 months and was found by his father in the corridor at 11 o'clock in the night, sitting on the floor with a wooden spoon and what appeared to be an agenda. Dunmore Hall recovered. It recovered the way things recover when the right person has found the right problem and addressed it precisely and without distraction from ego. Beatrice's accounting structure, the one she had proposed in the carriage after the consortium meeting and implemented in the 18 months following the wedding, was adopted, with modifications, by 3 neighbouring estates on the advice of their own land agents and by Lord Ashby's 2 sons when they inherited their respective properties. The annotated model she produced was circulated through the County Agricultural Society with a title page that read, Estate Accounts Management, A Practical Guide, by B.E. Alcott, formerly Ashworth. The formerly was her idea. She wanted the record to reflect both names, because both had done real work. The kitchen garden at Thornfield was converted into a productive nursery for the estate. The Thornfield property itself remained in her name, as was specified in the marriage agreement she had negotiated with Frederick's solicitor for 3 days, before producing a counterdraft that was more favourable to both parties. Frederick had read the counterdraft, looked at her, and said, "You redrafted my solicitor's agreement." She had said, "Your solicitor's agreement contained 2 clauses that were disadvantageous to you. I corrected them." He had said, "You corrected clauses that were disadvantageous to me. In an agreement you were the other party to." She had said, "If we are going to build something, it should be built correctly." He had signed the counterdraft. Thornfield was the property that remained hers. She used it, in the years that followed, as the base for the financial advisory practice she built, quietly, by referral, in the manner of someone who does not advertise, but whose work speaks clearly enough that advertising is unnecessary. She took 4 clients in the first year and 11 in the third, and she kept her ledger in the same precise hand she had kept since she was 17 years old, in her father's study in Wiltshire, when she had organised the tenancy agreements, and her father had said, "B, you see things," and she had not yet known what that meant, but had kept going anyway. She had been right to keep going. On a Tuesday evening in October, some years into the life they had built, Beatrice sat at the piano in the Dunmore music room, the East Wing room, with the tall windows that let in the parkland air in summer and the firelight in winter, and played the Scottish air variations that had been the elder Duchess's favourite piece. James was asleep. The house was quiet in the way that inhabited houses are quiet, not empty, but resting. She could hear Frederick somewhere in the corridor, the particular sound of his footstep, which she knew as well now as she knew the sound of her own pen on paper. He stopped in the doorway. She knew he was there without turning to look. She played through to the end of the third variation, let the last chord resolve completely, and then she was still for a moment with her hands in her lap. "You're listening," she said. "I am," he said. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with his coat still on, which meant he had come in from the yard, and there was a smudge of something on his left cuff that suggested he had been attending to something practical, because he always was. His cravat was straight. She had straightened it herself that morning, and it had held. He was watching her with the full weight of everything he was, which was considerable, and which she received entirely. "Come in," she said. "I'll play it again from the beginning." He came in. He sat beside her on the bench. There was room, because she had left it, which she had been doing for some years now without planning to. She began again at the beginning of the Scottish air, and the fire was warm, and outside the windows, the Dunmore parkland held the autumn dark, and the house that had been declining for 30 years was standing.